All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out, you guys. I had to step away for about a week to take care of some personal stuff. I'm back. I got a couple stories lined up for you guys. So without further ado, let me get into this next story about a major staff assault that took place in Centinela State Prison. So like I said, this story right here is about a major staff assault that occurred in Centinela State Prison sometime around August of 2008. So at the time, the yard was being ran by Turi from Cucas. However, because this was back in 2008, several years before they let everyone out of the shoe, Turi appointed Pájaro from Eastside Longo to run the yard under his authority. You know, I'm sure most of you guys have heard about Turi before in the past. Whether it was one of my previous stories, another story you might have seen on YouTube, or some of you might have even done time with him before in prison. But either way, if you're aware of who he is and how he operates, then you know that he's one of those old school type of Mexican mafia members that pushes a hard line. You know, Turi was also one of those types of guys who took a profound interest in studying Mexican history, Mexican culture, Aztec and Mayan history, and Nahua. You know, Nahua is a dialect of the Aztec language. You know, some of us took an interest in self-educating. We self-educated ourselves when we were stuck back there in the SHU program, using all that idle time productively, opposed to sitting around all day watching BET and Rap City. And Turi was obviously one of those who used that time to self-educate. In fact, he was so deeply absorbed in the Aztec and Mayan literature that he would actually pray to the Aztec gods and incorporate some of the terminology in his day-to-day business writings, meaning the kites and the filters that he'd write to his fellow Mexican mafia members and some of the sureños who worked under him. You know, I'm not going to delve too much into his personal history, but he is one of the few Mexican mafia members that got himself in hot water, was deemed no good, and then was allowed to return to the fold and have his status restored. You know, at one point, Turi also overseen and controlled one of the most vast and biggest areas of Mexican mafia controlled operations within that organization. This not only included neighborhoods, cities, and street territories, but also a number of state prisons as well. So my source for this story was in Centinela when this incident occurred and was actually part of Turi's leadership circle. In fact, he was there in Centinela for a couple of years, so the information that I'm giving you guys is from a first-hand account. And let me also make it clear that he's still active, so this isn't someone that went postal, or he isn't someone that others would often describe as someone being a disgruntled employee. He's still in the mix and he doesn't have any axes to grind. Anyways, for the purpose of this story, I'll refer to him from this point on as Sniper from Florencia. So Sniper started this story out by describing the program on the yard and how Pájaro implemented Turi's policies. And again, this was in Centinela sometime around August of 2008 on D Yard. So he described the yard as being a fully functioning yard, and that Pájaro's primary focus out there on the yard was security. And obviously being under Turi was to generate money from clavo that they were hitting. So Sniper went on to say that the daily routine consisted of the basic fundamentals: maintaining security on the yard, investing at least 2 hours in a topic that you were studying, and then they were also required to work out or do some form of physical exercises daily. They also had mandatory yard, where there was always a designated number of sureños out on the yard on patrol, and they all had bangers. And this was done on rotation. They had a system where they appointed a specific group to be out there at all times throughout the day. And this was done regardless of whether or not there was tension on the yard. Sniper said that this was something that Pájaro had always emphasized: security and always keeping their ear to the ground. And at that time, back in 2008, there wasn't any norteños on that yard either. According to Sniper, they had an on-site green light on them and they couldn't walk that line. Now keep in mind, this was well before the agreement to end hostilities was put into effect. But the administration was well aware of the impending war that was still on at that time. So when a norteño would pull up to that prison, they'd take them straight to the ASU, the Administrative Segregation Unit, straight off the bus. So according to Sniper, there was some solid sureños that were on the yard at that time. And most of them were older second and third termers who had been around and who all knew how to do time. In fact, Sniper claimed that when it came to Pájaro appointing those that would be assigned to his mesa, the yard was overqualified. Instead of Pájaro having a hard time filling these positions because there was a lack of experience out there, he had a hard time filling his leadership positions because there were so many potential candidates to choose from. But in the end, he ultimately chose the following individuals as his meseros: Raton from Vista Homeboys, Chops from Cherryville, Pomona, Curly from Primera Flats, Sleepy from San Isidro, and Diablo from 38th Street. So when this incident happened, D-Yard had just come off of a 1.5 year long lockdown. and this was due to an incident that kicked off between the Africanos and the Sureños. I'll be covering that story sometime in the near future as well, but this was when they were still doing those long marathon lockdowns. Eventually CDCR would get away from doing these long lockdowns that would sometimes last for several years. But after several inmates at different prisons took this issue up with the courts, they eventually got away from that practice. In the past, they would just slam the prison down for a couple of weeks while they transferred out all the instigators and all those who were identified as being the aggressors. But later on at some point, CDCR started using this as a reason to justify keeping the yard locked down. Why not? It was less work for them. And they were more susceptible at doing this anytime there was a racially motivated riot or a riot between the North and South. The conflicts that they took serious. Like I said, I'll be covering the details of what happened in this riot between the Crips and the Sureños in an upcoming story, possibly next. But believe it or not, it basically kicked off over a pull-up bar. I'm telling you guys, I'm not bullshitting when I say some of the biggest and bloodiest wars that kick off in prison happen behind some of the most trivial, pettiest shit that you can think of. But I'll give you guys the short version of it. Basically, this all kicked off behind real estate and pride. So apparently there was a Crip that transferred from Pelican Bay to Centinela. And when he pulled up to that yard, he obviously seen some things that he didn't like. I guess he didn't like the fact that the Africanos as a collective had so many pull-up bars in comparison to how many the Sureños had. So then this turns into a game of pride and posturing. The Crip felt like the Africanos were being oppressed and he didn't like it. It might seem petty and it might be oppression on a small level, but these are the everyday politics that play out in prison. And I believe that this was exasperated by the fact that the Sureños were controlling the numbers. This turned it into a bigger problem because this particular Crip that was leading the charge obviously felt like the Sureños were trying to dictate and control the yard's real estate. And just to clarify, when I say real estate, I don't mean houses and buildings. I mean things like benches, tables, handball courts, areas of the yard, etc., etc. So then on the flip side, the Sureños felt like they'd be losing territory if they conceded to this Crip's demands. So this brought them to an impasse. So then on the flip side, the Sureños felt like they'd be losing territory if they conceded to this Crip's demands, which then brought them to an impasse where both groups refused to negotiate, which then led to a small war. The other thing that Sniper said was that this Crip was an aggressive individual. He wasn't asking, he was making demands. And basically the Sureños felt like this guy was talking to him like he thought they were a bunch of punks. That's when everything went sideways. So the defining issue is the pull-up bar. Now they're at an impasse and tension continues to escalate on the yard. So in the meantime, while all this is going on, apparently another Llavero that was on B yard, an individual by the name of Big O from Lennox, he gets moved to D yard. They brief him on everything that's happening on the yard and he makes the decision that the following day they're gonna kick it off. But unfortunately for Big O, that plan never materializes because according to Sniper, some of his own people dropped a kite on Big O and got him rolled up. Somebody told the administration that he was instigating a conflict, so they took him to ADSEC. However, in his absence, two of his main boys, Scrappy from Michigan and Carlitos from Lamont, both stepped up and followed through with his plan. Sniper said they ended up kicking it off and making sure that everybody that participated had weapons. Sniper said they made sure everybody on the yard was strapped and then they kicked it off. The story's a banger. I think you guys are gonna like it because they go back and forth while they're on modified program and then some other shit happens. They go at it pretty good, but towards the end, the Africanos end up catching Spanky from Virginia Street slipping and they end up booking the shit out of him. They end up hitting him somewhere around 42 times. And then supposedly, Youngster from Small Town and Topo from Barrio Van Nuys, they ended up catching some flack for not defending them and not jumping like they were supposed to. In the end, Youngster ends up locking it up for getting caught with some paperwork. And after accepting his checking, Topo kept it solid and stayed out on the yard. Some of you that are watching might have even been there when this happened. That's why I'm throwing out some of the details of what happened. So that right there is the gist of it. But like I said, I'll be running a story on it soon, if not next. Anyways, due to the fact that this was a fully functioning structured yard, Barro maintained a level of respect, not just amongst some of the other group segments that were out there on the yard, but also amongst the COs and the administration as well. What I mean by that is this: when you've been around and you become accustomed to doing time, you know how to run the type of program that will keep the COs from imposing their will on you. If you run a tight program and they see that discipline is being enforced by leadership, this prevents them from doing all the extra shit. Things like conducting excessive cell searches, disrespecting your personal property, not running program for whatever excuse they decide to come up with. And it just basically stops them from finding a reason to push that line and disrupt the program. And it's also a smart way to protect your contraband, because believe me, when you're in prison, you learn to appreciate your contraband. So there were specific policies that Pájaro implemented when it came to their interaction with the COs, such as they were never to verbally disrespect them, they were always to address them with a level of respect, they were forbidden from horseplaying with them, and anytime anyone had a conversation with the CO, they always had to have an extra set of ears there to listen. You know, there was really nothing complicated about it. Pájaro was just mandating the type of policies that would afford them the respect that they deserved. And the fundamental purpose behind it was just to minimize the heat and keep a positive line of communication open with the COs. However, with that being said, they still had other policies in effect that could have created some dicey situations and a full hands-on fight if it ever escalated. And this had to do with anyone holding weapons, bundles of kites, or hot paperwork. So in the event that they were in their cells and the COs tried to do a random search, under no circumstances were they ever to allow any weapons, hot paperwork, or bundles of kites to ever get confiscated or intercepted. So they were directed to destroy or get rid of them by any means necessary. This meant to either physically eat or flush the kites or do whatever they had to do as long as they didn't get intercepted. And the weapons, they were either to be flushed or disassembled, whatever they could do the fastest. You know, but here's the thing, whenever they would do a random search and they would roll up on somebody's cell, they'd always try to catch you slipping. And this was when things were more likely to get physical and go left, because this is what they do. So the first thing they do when they run up to your cell is they'd have the door popped open. Once the door was popped open, then they tell you don't touch nothing and to come out of the cell, because their whole objective is to prevent anyone from destroying or getting rid of their contraband, especially dangerous or sensitive contraband. But on the other hand, knowing what the consequences consisted of, these guys would fight tooth and nail and do whatever they had to do in order to dispose or get rid of whatever they had, because again, they knew what the consequences entailed. If they got caught with hot paperwork, regardless of how it happened, whether they willingly relinquished it, got caught slipping, or inadvertently lost it, the consequences resulted in them getting hit themselves. So it often became to be a desperate situation for not only the COs, but for also whoever it was that they were trying to catch. And here's the thing, despite trying to maintain somewhat of a positive rapport with the COs and trying to avoid situations where it ends up getting physical, these types of situations are almost unavoidable. All gloves come off when these stakes are on the line, because then it comes down to either getting physical with them or protecting the integrity of your people. And obviously, protecting the integrity of your people always prevails. So again, Sniper said that yard was mandatory. You had to be out there all day, suited and booted, unless you were given clearance to do otherwise. And this meant staying out on the yard all day until yard recall. Regardless of rain, sun, or shine, you had to be out there. You know, the other thing that Sniper said was that the yard was flooded with glauber. They had multiple people hitting on a consistent basis, and they were letting people pretty much do their own thing out there. If you elected to freelance and make your own bag, then they permitted you to do that, just as long as you played by the rules and gave a third of whatever it was that you were getting in. But overall, with the exception of the 1.5 year lockdown that they were on, Sniper said that this was a good yard. It was one of the better yards that he had ever been on. So after being on this 1.5 year lockdown, the administration ended up housing most of the sureños in the gym. Why they did this was anyone's guess, because by the time they opened the yard back up, there was no more tension on the yard, and there was no reason for them to keep these guys separated. And since it had been almost 18 months since they had gotten into it with the Africanos, most of the individuals that were involved in that riot, the instigators or the ones that perpetrated the conflict, had either paroled, had been shipped to other prisons, or had been moved to another yard. In fact, Sniper said that after 18 months, the yard had pretty much flipped, and there was a lot of new faces out there. But either way, a lot of the sureños that were out there on the yard at that time were still moved to the gym. You know, I've talked about being housed in the gym and some of my other stories, but they actually started housing inmates in the gyms at different prisons across the state of California as far back as 1991. In fact, I was still in Susanville when they started doing it, and this was all being done based on the fact that they claimed at that time that there was severe and excessive prison overcrowding throughout all the prisons in the state of California. You know, when I got to Susanville back in 1989, the gyms were still being used as gyms. You could go in there and you could play handball, you could play basketball, or you could use some of the other rec equipment that they still had in there. But sometime around 1991, around the same time that I started seeing tractors and other heavy equipment that they used to break ground for high desert, they gutted the gym and moved in hundreds of bunk beds to make room for more inmates. So the bunks that they put in the gym in Susanville were double stacked, but some of the other prisons had bunk beds that were triple stacked. So they made good use out of all the extra space that they had in the gyms. You know, I never personally had the unfortunate experience of being housed in a gym myself, but depending on where you were at or where you were housed, some people said that being housed in the gym was actually kind of cool. It was like living in a huge dorm, and I guess if you like doing your time like that, the one good thing about it is that you had free reign to roam around as much as you wanted. You didn't have to worry about being locked up or being confined to a cell. So Sniper said that the gym in Centinela had its own set of policies that everybody that lived in the gym had to abide by. He described it as also being a structured environment and said that when you were in the gym, you had to be conscious of where you were at and what aisle you walked down. Certain aisles belonged to certain groups, and it was all predicated on security. The Africanos had a designated area that was theirs, the Woods had a designated area that belonged to them, and the same thing with the Sureños. So you couldn't just walk between any bunks you wanted or navigate a shortcut just because you wanted to get to your bunk faster. You had to be conscious of these things, because walking down the wrong aisle or too close to someone's area could have ended up kicking something off inadvertently. And it was on every group to make sure that their people were well aware of these policies. But you learn fast, and that's just prison. You know, if you walk up behind someone too fast or you walk into a designated area that's controlled by another group, they might assume that you have bad intentions or that it's an act of aggression. Then the next thing you know, you end up kicking off a small riot, all because you lost sight of where you navigated. You know, again, the gym was like being in an open dorm, so the program was always open. If you wanted to stay up all night playing pinochle or dominoes, then that was on you. But shutdown was at 11 o'clock, and that was something that everyone had to respect. You had guys in there that worked, others had visits, or maybe they just wanted to get some sleep. So everybody respected the shutdown and kept noise down to a minimum after 11 p.m. Those that violated this policy or others who were non-compliant were removed by their people, or it became an issue. So another one of the unwritten policies that the inmates in the gym had amongst each other pertained to weapons. They agreed amongst each other that if anyone was ever seen with a weapon for whatever reason, whether it was because they were moving it, manufacturing it, or just carrying it, that it had to be flushed. That they flush it, and they'd also check their own people for it happening. Because here's the thing, everybody knows that every group or every ethnicity, whether it be the Africanos, the Woods, the Sureños, or the others, they all have weapons. It's a vital part of everyone's security, and it's a part of being in prison. And obviously, this is something that's commonly known across the board. But you're always supposed to keep your weapons hidden or concealed. Nobody but your own people should ever see them. Because if someone sees a weapon being passed or moved on the yard, that's going to create immediate tension. And you've now posed yourself as a threat to whoever it was that seen it. And the first thing that someone outside of your circle is going to think is that something's happening, that these individuals are getting ready to move on someone. Maybe them. And that's a message you don't want to send, especially if there's already tension on the yard. You know, think about it. If there's some type of open-ended conflict in the air that hasn't been resolved, and everybody on the yard is on high alert, anticipating that something might happen, you can bet your last dollar that you definitely ignited a war if you're sloppy enough to let someone else see you pass a piece at a time like that. They're gonna end up drawing their own conclusions, and they're gonna act on it. You know, this ain't no training video on the protocols of what not to do in prison, but all bullshit aside, you gotta be careful about this kind of stuff and always be mindful of the fact that other people are always watching you, evaluating you, and assessing your movements. And they're supposed to, as their own survival is dependent on their own observations and their own ability to detect these kinds of things. So the other unwritten rule amongst all the inmates in the gym that's worthy of pointing out pertains to smoking and trying to be discreet about it. Sniper said that there was so much tobacco and so much yesk on that yard that a couple of times these guys actually hotboxed the gym. He said one time it looked like a Las Vegas casino when the door opened and all the smoke came out. But you know, living in the gym and cell living is obviously a lot different. You could hotbox your cell and smoke like a train if that's what you wanted to do. Because at the end of the day, you're only fronting yourself off. And if you bring heat to your cell, it's only your cell that's gonna get hit. But when you're living in a big open area like a dorm, if you get reckless and you start smoking whenever you want and you start fronting off the COs that work in there, you're gonna end up getting the whole gym hit, and that's gonna create problems. I mean, think about it. If someone else in there gets hit and they lose their contraband because some idiot was walking around like Snoop Dogg smoking fat ass blunts at all times of the day, this eventually is gonna create a potential problem. Those similar situations happen like this all the time in the buildings. Someone smokes at the wrong time of the day, or someone's bistro got the whole block smelling like a brewery, and as a result, they come in and hit everyone's cells. If someone else ends up losing something and they know it's a direct result of your stupidity or your indiscretions, things are gonna end up going all bad. They're gonna end up blaming you for getting them busted. And let's just say, for argument's sake, this ends up leading to somebody losing a pound of Yeska or a couple of ounces of Chris or Black. Do you think they're just gonna eat that loss and be blasé about it? Hell nah. They're gonna feel some type of way and they're gonna want to be compensated. So Sniper said that over the course of the next 2 months after they got off lockdown, that they did some minor house cleaning. And this was because a lot of new faces had pulled up on that yard during the time that they were on lockdown. So while all this was in motion, they also tried to reestablish some of their old contacts, their facilitators, and some of their communication hubs. Keep in mind that back in 2008, these kinds of things were still important because they still had to communicate with leadership that were still housed in the SHU. They also worked on opening up some of their old routes that they were using to bring in their global, something that was extremely important, especially where Turi was concerned. So these were just a few of the individuals that got removed during that 2-month span that Sniper talked about after they came off lockdown. Flaco from Carnales was hit behind his controlling case. Apparently, after looking into his convictions, they found out that he'd been convicted for child neglect. According to the police reports, he broke one of his baby's arms. And when he got to Centinela, he tried to offer up a lame excuse, minimizing his involvement, but nobody was buying it. So Moreno from Florencia was hit next. He was hit for not defending his people. The Sureños got off with the COs on B Yard behind another incident of disrespect, and he was one of the only ones that didn't jump. The third individual that was hit was Baby from Southside Bakers. He was hit after they found out that he had an R on his jacket. Sniper didn't have any of the details with regards to what the R was for. All he knew was that this guy got his covers pulled and that he didn't have a viable explanation of why he had it. So for those of you that don't know, an R is a suffix for restriction. And when an inmate has an R in his jacket, that means he's restricted from participating in certain activities because he's either a sex offender or he has some other type of case that includes crimes of moral turpitude. Weirdo crimes like cases against women and children. And don't quote me on this, but I think you can also get an R for arson and or escape. But either way, if you have an R in your jacket, your paperwork is all bad. And barring some type of miraculous explanation as to why you have it, you're pretty much cooked. It basically means your driver's license has been revoked. But anyways, everyone that was housed in the gym were all well aware of where the boundaries were at, what the policies consisted of, and for the most part, they were all on the same page. As far as the COs that worked in the gym, Sniper said they were cool and they let them run their own program under the condition that they didn't front them off or they didn't make it look like they weren't doing their jobs. So for the most part, they had a good rapport with the COs, and again, they kept their interaction respectful. But the monotony in prison is always broken. Harmony never lasts for too long because at any given time, someone new might come in, maybe a rookie or someone with a bad attitude, and then that respect, it all goes out the window. But this is prison, so you kind of expect these things to happen. This is an environment that's usually already hostile, whether it's the COs or the inmates. And keep in mind, there doesn't always have to be a rhyme or a reason for something kicking off either. Somebody might not like the way that someone's talking to them, or you might have a CO that's on some type of power trip. It happens all the time. In this particular situation, it sounds like it was a little bit of both. So in a nutshell, this is what happened. It was during evening chow that a Sureño named Weasel from Dominguez ended up getting into a verbal fist fight with the CO that was coordinating the seating arrangement in the chow hall. A routine that they had been through hundreds and hundreds of times before in the past. But it was on this particular day that the CO decided that he was going to push a hard line. Probably because he felt like Weasel was undermining his authority and that he was testing the waters. Let me try to put this in perspective for you guys so you guys understand why this conflict started. So whenever you go into a chow hall, there's always one line that the inmates stand in. And as the line continues to move and the inmates grab their trays, there's a CO that directs traffic and makes sure that all the seats at the tables are filled. And most of the chow halls at the different prisons in California are usually constructed the same, or they have the same concept. There's an open aisle leading to a window where the trays are dispensed, and then there's 4 seats at every table. So eventually, when you make your way to the window where the kitchen workers are dispensing the trays, you grab your tray when it's your turn, and then you follow the line of traffic leading to the tables. But in my experience, when I was still on the main line, the chow hall was open seating. You sat where you wanted, and it was segregated. You had a certain amount of tables for the Africanos, a certain amount for the Norteños, a certain amount for the Sureños, and in the woods, they had a certain amount of tables. And at that time, the inmates chose to segregate the chow hall. So the COs, they let us sit where we wanted to sit. But every prison is different. Some prisons have a CO that sits inmates down as they come in. And because of that, there was no self-segregating. And apparently, Centinela was one of those prisons. So let's just say you're standing in line with 2 of your homies for the sake of this story. Obviously, your intentions are to sit at the same table with them, but unfortunately, it doesn't always work out like that. By the way, for those of you that are wondering, yes, that is Chewy, and he's doing a lot better. I got his insulin regulated, and he's a lot better now. If there's 3 other inmates in front of you guys, the CO is going to tell those 3 guys to sit down at a table, and then he's going to tell one of you, whoever's in front, to take that 4th seat. That's just the way it goes. So you might end up at a table with 3 other Africanos, or you might end up at a table with a Wood and 2 Africanos. However it happens, the bottom line is it's gonna split you up and you're not gonna be able to sit at the same table with your 2 homies. That's just the luck of the draw, and for the most part, again, that's just how it goes. But here's the thing, a cool CO, he'll probably catch this and he won't make an issue out of it because it's just not that serious. He'll see that you're trying to sit at the same table with your boys, so he'll have another inmate take that 4th seat. Problem solved. His whole purpose is just to sit everyone down, and he don't care about guys swapping seats so that they can sit with their own people. But again, that's only if you get lucky and you end up catching a CO that's cool. But 2 things ended up happening in this scenario that led to the conflict between Weasel and this CO that was working the seating arrangement. The first thing that happened was that the CO wasn't a regular and he wasn't cool. He was only working on that yard that day, and they just so happened to put him in the chow hall. He was one of those slapsticks that was enforcing all the rules, and he wasn't trying to do anyone any favors. The second thing that happened took place when Weasel and his 2 homies went to sit at a table. Weasel was caught in the front and technically was supposed to sit at the other table before them since there was only 3 seats filled. But instead of sitting at the other table and taking the 4th seat, he sat down at a table with his 2 homies, leaving that other seat open. Are you guys following me, or should I be writing a diagram? Well, I don't got a diagram, so you better be following me. So when the CO seen Weasel do this, he told him to sit at the other table and to fill the open seat. Initially, Weasel just sat there and he ignored him. He was probably thinking, man, this dude's a punk. Why is he tripping? Why is he sweating the small shit? So in the meantime, the line of inmates started to back up. Nobody was being sat at the tables because the CO was distracted with Weasel. The CO was basically waiting for Weasel to get up and move to the other table before he continued to sit the rest of the inmates down. So at that point, when it became obvious that Weasel was ignoring this guy, this CO ratcheted everything up by taking his knee and nudging Weasel in the back, telling him to move to the other table. And when he does this, Weasel spins around on his seat and he tells the CO, don't do that again. Keep your hands to yourself. Or in this case, keep your knee to yourself. So now this turns into a clash of the egos. Weasel feels disrespected because this CO need him in the back in front of his boys. And the CO, he feels played because Weasel's not acknowledging him. So what does the CO do? Instead of de-escalating the situation, he takes his knee and he knees Weasel in the back a second time. And when the CO does this, Weasel jumps up, spins around, and takes a quick 3-piece. Bing, pop, bing! This then sets off a chain of events in the chow hall, and the whole chow hall erupts. So this CO that Weasel bombed on, he steps back, he pivots his feet, and then he gets ready to throw a punch back at Weasel. But by this time, the other 2 Sureños that walked in the chow hall with Weasel, they both swarmed in and started packing this guy out. So the two that were identified as being involved was Tiempo from Crazies and Chaos from Criminals. Meanwhile, Sniper and some of the other sureños who were still in the gym, waiting to be let out next for chow, heard the commotion and knew something was happening in the chow hall. Sniper said they were debating on whether or not to get off, but instead of jumping the gun and prematurely starting a war before getting all the facts, they decided to wait. And it ended up being the right thing to do, because a few minutes later, when they started escorting some of the sureños out that were in the chow hall, they confirmed to Sniper and some of the other sureños that were in the gym that it wasn't with the Africanos, that it was with the COs. So that situation transpires in the chow hall, and after it happens, they clear out the chow hall and they take Weasel, Tiempo, and Chaos to ADSE. In the meantime, because it was an assault against staff, they slammed down the entire yard and they put everybody on modified program. This consists of controlled feeding, limited movement, and everybody segregated. So because they were now on modified program, that meant that everybody in the gym was on automatic bunk status, meaning they had to stay on their bunks and they couldn't roam around in the gym. Nobody was allowed to come off their bunk for any reason. The only exception was to use the bathroom and to take a shower. And showers were done at a controlled designated time. So if you were housed in the gym, the program consisted of you laying on your bunk, either reading a book or chopping it up with your bunkie. That's all you could really do. And because the gym was considered to be an open dorm where inmates posed more of a threat, they put an extra 6 or 7 officers to work in the gym as an added security measure. According to Sniper, most of the COs that they put in the gym were all cool. They were all regulars, but then they put in this older CO that had a bad attitude. You know, there's always that one bad apple that stirs the pot and creates problems for everyone else. And this old buzzard wouldn't stop. You know, based on the way that he was acting, you think that maybe he had a son that was constantly getting his lunch money taken at school by gangbangers, because he made a full-time project out of finding issues to nitpick about. And it was only being directed at sureños, so it started to look like it was personal. At one point, he threatened to have the goon squad come in and shake their bunks and their lockers down if they didn't stop talking. And apparently this went on for some time, but Sniper said that he had a good rapport with some of the other COs that worked in there. And for the purpose of avoiding this turning into a bigger problem with this older guy, he said he decided to get at this other CO that he had a good rapport with. And he basically said that he asked this CO that he thought he had a good rapport with if he could talk to the older guy about calming down, and that all the negativity wasn't necessary and that they weren't trying to cause any problems. But this CO flipped the script on him, and he told him that that was his partner and that he had an obligation to back his play no matter what, period. So Sniper tells this CO, okay, if that's how you guys want it, then that's how it's gonna be then. And the response that he got back was, it's whatever then. Whatever happens, happens. So Sniper goes back and conveys this to Sleepy from San Isidro, who had the gym at that time. And after hearing it, Sleepy says, you know what? Fuck these fools. If that's what they want, then we'll give it to them. So at that point, they were still kind of waiting to see how far that older CO wanted to take it. And their plans to rush the COs were still tentative. So apparently the breaking point came when Sniper and some of the other sureños would occasionally yell out llaves anytime a CO would walk towards the back of the gym. It's basically a security caveat, warning the other inmates that there's a CO walking back there, giving them a heads up. And this is a common practice. It's something that's done everywhere. County jails, prisons, anywhere where you do time. Whenever a CO walks the tiers or enters a housing unit, there's always some type of security caveat that's announced. It could be llaves, hot water, kukui on deck, 5-0 walking, etc., etc. And it was this older CO that didn't like them making this announcement. Every time they said it, he threatened to write them up. And obviously nobody gave 2 fucks about whether he liked it or not. So they refused to acknowledge him and they continued to do it. So the other thing that this older CO started doing was he started singling out this youngster named Twinkie from Sureños 13. And again, he made it personal. He told him he was going to put him on bunk status after everybody else came off, and he wrote him up 3 times for making that announcement. And from that point on, he just looked for any reason to keep fucking with him. So eventually, Twinkie and the CO, they end up having words, and from there, it just continued to escalate. Sniper said that at one point, this older CO pulls out his collapsible baton like he was gonna do something. And then he tells Twinkie to come down off his bunk and to prone out on the floor. All because he said llaves. Twinkie tells him to go fuck himself and that he ain't gonna do shit. So the old man then pulls out his OC spray, and without saying anything else, he sprays Twinkie in the face. And after catching the brunt of it in his eyes where he can't see, Twinkie rushes the CO and he starts swinging on him with his eyes closed. And that's when it all kicked off. When Sniper and some of the other Sureños seeing what was happening, they all rushed over there and they started packing this old guy out. So some of the ones that were involved in this incident was Slinky from Victoria Park, Pirate from Langdon, Sleepy from San Isidro, Little One from East LA, Beto from Florence, Rabbit from Pacoima Projects, Fat Boy from Blythe Street, Largo from Canoga Park, Little G from Westside Drifters, and Criminal from Ontario. So after they get on this older CO, his backup starts arriving, and now it turns into an all-out brawl. COs and inmates were going at it everywhere in the gym, and most of the Sureños that got involved just went hands-on. But Sniper and a couple of others, they had bangers. So Sniper said that at one point, one of the younger COs, a CO named Ibarra, he said something to the effect of, "Stop, I have a family." And then surprisingly, he said that the older CO, the one that started everything, he didn't say shit. He was just taking his ass whooping. And every time he got knocked down, he kept getting back up. Every time someone kicked him or punched him, he would fall down and then he'd pop back up. And because of that, Sniper said that as much as he didn't care for the guy, he was worthy of respecting. So Sniper said they managed to book a couple of the COs before the gun tower started firing off rounds. I'm not sure how many, but from the sounds of it, it didn't sound like any of them got hurt bad. And coincidentally, the CO in the gun tower ended up being a female named Miramontes. And Sniper said that as soon as it kicked off, she started shooting. She fired off a couple of rounds from the block gun, probably just for the sake of exercising protocol. And then she started shooting live rounds. You know, if you think about it, it was probably a little gutsy of her to be shooting live rounds from the Mini 14 when there was that many staff involved in this fight. But either she was a good shot or she just got lucky, because out of all the rounds she fired, she only ended up hitting Criminal from Ontario. And unfortunately for him, she ended up blowing the tip of his nose off. You know, but he's probably lucky he wasn't standing at another angle. Otherwise, he would have been a fatality. You know, needless to say, once Criminal got hit, this pretty much ended the fight. Everybody started proning out and hitting the deck, not wanting to be the next one to get shot. You know, the other thing that Sniper said is that this all happened in the front of the gym. So a lot of the COs that were responding to this incident, as soon as they were coming through the doors, they were getting assaulted and hit right there. And one of them ended up being a female. She was punched in the face, and this was something that they would actually be highly upset about. But let's keep it real. This obviously only lasted for so long, because no matter how many people you have fighting, eventually the COs are gonna flood the area and they're gonna turn the tables. There's just too many of them. Everyone knows that if you're gonna get into it with the COs, you gotta get yours in quick. You gotta do it fast before the backups start coming in. And according to what Sniper said, that's what they did. So Sniper said that everybody that was involved in this incident, they all picked up cases. And they all ended up getting dealt out anywhere from 3 to 6 years. The other thing that he said was that they drug their feet and they lagged on giving Criminal medical attention. Apparently, they kept him caged up in the watch office for 20 minutes bleeding, despite knowing that he'd been shot in the face. You know, not knowing how bad it was or not knowing if he had a bullet lodged in his brain opened them up to liability. But obviously, they didn't care. So after they got sentenced, he said that most of them were put on a bus and shipped off to Calipatria. And he said when they got transferred to Calipatria, they were getting dogged out. Every day they take their mattresses, they wouldn't give them any sheets or blankets, they wouldn't let them go to store, and they tore their cells up on a regular basis. He said at night, they come in and pull them out to yard at 2 or 3 in the morning, and then they put them in the shower with only cold water. He said this lasted for about 3 or 4 months, and then eventually they found out why. They obviously knew that it was for assaulting COs, but then later on they found out that this all stemmed from the fact that they were really upset about the female CO that got assaulted. They were upset about the fact that she got punched in the face and her husband was also a CO that worked at that same prison. So there you guys have it. Another story that occurred in Centinela State Prison. You know, like I said in the beginning of this story, although nobody's gonna accept being disrespected by some of these COs that have bad attitudes or the ones that bring their problems to work with them, these situations are usually still avoided because at the end of the day, the inmates know that this is a fight that they're eventually gonna lose. They might hit a CO and they might even take one out. But there's long-term consequences that come along with something like this. And that's just the reality of it. You know, and as you've seen by this story, you might establish a good rapport with the CO or a group of COs. But at the end of the day, when the shit hits the fan and it kicks off, that rapport becomes non-existent, and they're always going to follow suit and back up their own. And that's to be expected, because you do the same thing if the tables were turned. You know, it's unfortunate that there's some COs that feel the need to shit on people when they're already at a dark and difficult place in their lives, and that sometimes it takes something as drastic as an act of violence for them to learn and understand that it ain't worth all that. This is not to say that all COs are like this either, because they're not. There's some good COs that come to work, do their job, and respect the inmates the way they should, as men. They don't come to work looking for a fight, and at some point they come to learn that the COs that come to work and do are usually the ones who are high-strung and who usually don't live 5 years past retirement. Prison has a lesson for everyone. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support, and also for continuing to tap into this channel. Until the next one, you guys keep pushing that positivity and enjoy the rest of your evening. With that being said, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.